Adam Gopnik here on the occasion of his new book, The Table Comes First, Family, France, and the Meaning of Food. With this book, Adam Gopnik traces our rapid evolution from commendable awareness of what we eat to manic compulsion and how, on the way, we've lost sight of a timeless truth. What goes on around the table, conversation among families, friends, and lovers, is always more important than what we put on the table. Adam Gopnik has been writing for The New Yorker since 1986. His other books include the essay collections Paris to the Moon, Through the Children's Gate, Angels and Ages, and Winter, 5 Windows on the Season. He has written 2 novels for children, The King in the Window and Steps Across the Water. He is a 3-time winner of the National Magazine Award for Essays and for Reviews and Criticism, and of the George Polk Award for Magazine Reporting. He lives in New York City. Following his talk, I'll pass around a microphone so that Mr. Gopnik can take questions from the audience, and then he'll sign copies of his book. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik to the Strand.
There we are. Oh, now you can hear me. It's not quite as good. I just came back from doing a lecture series in Canada where they had one of those, one of the mics that come around like this, and my daughter said, "Oh, Daddy, you've got the full Bieber on." So was bending around too. Now I have to share with you, I love this place. I love the Strand bookstore. I've spent in the 30 years I've been in New York, off and on. I've spent an enormous amount of time here and made many wonderful discoveries here. A great bookstore like this is really like a great stream. I'm not a fishing man, but I would imagine that if you fished, it couldn't be more emotionally compelling than the experience of a great bookstore, because you find things that you don't expect to find, and you struggle when you do find them. But the advantage that a bookstore has, a great bookstore, over even a fishing stream, is that you find bits of your own past. And I couldn't help but share with you that I found moments ago in the paperback section, and I will buy this. I'm encouraging everyone to buy books tonight. A Man from U.N.C.L.E. novel from sometime in the mid-'60s called The Dagger Affair. And I remember this book as though I read it yesterday, because it was the first time I ever came into contact with the idea of nihilism. Because the bad guy in this book isn't just a bad guy who wants to, may he say it, rule the world. He's a bad guy who wants to destroy mankind because he's a nihilist, because he's read Nietzsche and he's just a very bad intellectual. And that was the first moment I ever was aware that there were people who believed that the destruction of mankind would be the greatest gift to the planet. So it was a key element in my moral education was this book. I haven't seen it in 40 years, and now I have it back in my hands. That can only happen to you in a great bookstore. This book, the new book, The Table Comes First, Family, France, and the Meaning of Food, is in a weird way, though not exactly about nihilism and its discontents, is about something not completely unrelated. And that's to say that it's about, more than any other single thing, it's about the relationship between our mouth taste and our moral taste. It's about the fundamental mystery that we all know as eating people, that this thing that we absolutely have to do, we have to eat in order to survive. We are vertebrates, we're animals that have to ingest food in order to go on. That out of this physical necessity, we have made an entire ethic, a culture, a civilization. Every group of human beings known to anthropology, to science, to other human beings, has rules, feelings, passions, restrictions, prohibitions, favorites when it comes to food. It's as though we instinctively take our mouth taste, take the things we like to eat, we enjoy eating, and we turn them into complicated moralities. God, for instance, loves to reason in this way. Somebody gave God a pork sausage once to taste. He said, "I don't like that at all. Therefore, any of you who ever taste this again will be regarded as a sinner and evicted from the tribe." Very deep inside of us, that is, the idea that a wafer could be the flesh of our God and the wine, his blood. Very few people, even if we don't participate in that particular faith practice, we rarely say, "That makes no sense. Run that by me again. I don't understand how anyone could even believe that." We understand that one of the most natural connections we can possibly make is between our mouth tastes and our moral tastes. Brillat-Savarin, the great French food writer, maybe the greatest of all food writers, and in some ways the first gastronomic writer, self-consciously gastronomic writer, put this same idea in a wonderfully simple way. He said we called in French besoin, we have needs, and we turn them into desires. And that's what gastronomy, that's what thinking about food does for us, and in a certain sense that is the meaning that food, the table, cooking, cuisine brings to us. So that's the overall moral, that's the overall structure of this book. That's its preoccupation, and that's its purpose. But I wasn't really able to start organizing this book, despite having 25 years worth of food writing that I had already done and that I wanted to, in some way, turn into a book, until I came, in the course of my reading, upon a letter. And the letter was not a letter that you would find in any cheerful review of gastronomic literature. Not a bit. I found it in a very obscure collection of resistance writing from World War II. Let me read it to you. It was written by a fellow named Jacques de Coeur. His real name was actually Daniel de Coeur-Dimanche, but he took the name Jacques de Coeur when he joined the French resistance in 1940 after the German invasion. He was a Marxist, a highly educated man, ironically a professor of German at the Lycée Henri IV, one of the great lycées, one of the great colleges, high schools, we would say, in France, in Paris. And he wrote to his parents, "You know that on May 24th, 1942, you know that for the past 2 months I've been expecting what is to happen to me this morning. So I've had the time to prepare myself for it. But since I have no religion, I have not given myself up to any meditation on death. Here are a few requests. I was able to send word to the woman I love. I wish that you would give her some of the things that are in my apartment, among them the menu of the inn at Le Quatre Pavés du Roi. All these last days together, you see, I have thought a lot about the good meals that we should have together when I was free. You will eat them now without me, all the family together. But not sadly, please. I want your thoughts to dwell on the good times that we have already shared. During these 2 months of solitude, without even anything to read, I have run over in my mind all my travels, all my experiences, and all the meals that I have eaten. I had an excellent meal with Sylvain on the 17th, and I have often thought of it with pleasure, as well as of that New Year's supper with Pierre and René. Questions of food, you see, have taken on a great importance." 2 hours later, Jacques de Coeur was shot and executed by the Nazis as a resistor. And yet that's the last letter he chose to write. Not about his religion, he didn't have one. Not about the virtues and values of France, not about the solidarity of international Marxism. No, he chose to write a last letter about the meals that he had eaten, the times that he had shared, an auberge in the country, an hour outside of Paris, that he had been to with the woman he loved. And as soon as I read that letter, I said, that's the question I want to address. What did he mean, Jacques de Coeur, in his last hours when he said, questions of food have taken on a great importance? He obviously didn't mean that he was looking forward to trying the trendiest place in Paris the next night. He obviously didn't even mean that, that he was hoping to lead a seminar in sustainable agriculture sometime in the near future. He obviously meant something that in one way was more ordinary than that, and at the same time was more profound than that. He meant that there was something about the regularity of dining. There was something about exactly the process I was trying to describe to you, about the way that we turn needs into desires, that for him in the last hours of his life defined what it meant to be human. And so I took that question, Jacques de Coeur's question, what are questions of food and why do they take on great importance for us? And I tried to turn it into a book. And what happens in this book is that it's organized rather like a meal. You start off with questions of arriving. There are two ways we eat in our civilization. We either go out to eat at a restaurant or we stay home and eat with our family. If we go out to eat, the fundamental institution we deal with is the restaurant. So I wanted to ask the question, what is a restaurant? Why do we have them? Where did they come from? Who first made them? How do they work? And then I wanted to ask the question about the recipes. We all of us who are home cooks, who spend our evenings and our days cooking, use recipes. We tend to use them very transparently. We just take it for granted that there will be a recipe and we will have it to cook from. But if you think about it, it's a very weird little document, the recipe. It's weird because it's completely unsatisfying. Nobody has ever fully succeeded in making the thing that they have read about. And it's doubly weird because it comes to us, we use them very often as a kind of literature. I wrote, "A man and a woman lie in bed at night in the short hour between kids' sleep and parents' sleep, turning down page corners as they read. She is leafing through a fashion magazine, and he through a cookbook. Why they read these things mystifies even the readers. The closet and the cupboard are both about as full as they're going to get. And though we can credit the fashion magazine reader with at least wanting to know what is in fashion when she sees it, what can the recipe reader possibly be reading for? The shelf of cookbooks long ago overflowed, so that the sad relations and failed hopes, Monet's Table, A Drizzle of Honey, The Lives and Recipes of Spain's Secret Jews." That's a real book, by the way, which I have on my shelf. It's actually taken from the records of the Inquisition, the records of the Spanish Inquisition, probably the only cookbook that comes from the records of the Spanish Inquisition. And it was secret Jews, Marranos, my family were among them on my mother's side, and they all had recipes that the Inquisition got out of them that showed that they were Jewish because they were kosher recipes. So the Inquisition would inquire, how do you make a chicken? And they would try and figure it out. And somebody found these recipes and saved them. I know what you're thinking. It's a very weird way to have a recipe book, and it's very strange when you open it up and you realize, this looks very good. And you realize that the person who made it was probably burned to death for having offered it. That's why it's not a very successful cookbook. These cookbooks are stacked horizontally, high up. The things the man knows how to make that are actually in demand are as fixed as any cocktail lounge pianist's set list. And for a clientele of children, every bit is devoted to the old favorites as the barflies around that piano. Make them Parmesan-crusted chicken, which is the feelings of food, every night, and they would be delighted. Though a dinner party looms, and with it the possibility of a new thing made and added to the repertoire, the truth is that, on the night, the amateur cook falls back, like the amateur actor, on the set recitation. It's going to be the lamb tagine or the roasted chicken thing with preserved lemons, and there's no helping it. Yet the new cookbooks continue to show up in bed, and the corners still go down. Vicarious pleasure? Well, more like deferred frustration. Anyone who cooks knows that it is in following recipes that one first learns about the anticlimax of the actual, the perpetual disappointment of the thing achieved. I learned it as a boy when I learned to bake. When I was in my early teens, the sick yearning for sweets that adolescents suffer often drove me, and afternoons taken off from school, to bake, which miraculously meant just doing what the book said and hoping to get the promised yield. I followed the recipes as closely as I could: dense Boston cream pie, Rigo Yanchi slices, soccer tort with apricot jam between the layers. The potential miracle of the cookbook was immediately apparent. You start with a feeling of greed, find a list of rules, assemble a bunch of ingredients, and then you have something to be greedy about. In cooking, you begin with the ache and end with the object, where in most of the life of the appetites, courtship and marriage, you start with the object and end with the ache. And I go on to write about the nature and the strange nature of cookbooks over time. And along the way, in doing my reporting on the history of cookbooks, I stumbled upon an extraordinary woman. Her name is Elizabeth Pannell. And she wrote a book in 1896 called Diary of a Greedy Woman. Her diary, I write, is a cookbook of a kind that wouldn't reappear until our own time, a first-person account of how to eat by cooking things. She affirms women as gluttons, creatures of the flesh, and the erotic, indeed oral erotic content of her book is so evident as almost to embarrass the modern reader. She writes, "Accept the gospel of good living, and the sexual problem will be solved." One of the bluntest and most magical sentences of the late 19th century. Her self-declaration as a greedy woman, not a dainty Epicurean damsel, not a loving wife and mother providing for her wee mouths, but a woman with an appetite on her and a hunger in her, is one of the most charming and yet truly radical self-fashionings of the era. So I decided that I would organize this book in addition to the chapters that set out like a dinner. You begin with arriving in a restaurant or using a recipe book. Then you move on to the act of choosing. Do we want meat or vegetables? What's the ethical engagement we have with that choice? Do we want our food from very nearby or very far away? Then in addition to those questions, I would write a series of emails to this extraordinary woman, this greedy woman I discovered in the late 19th century, Elizabeth Pannell, that would discuss exactly the irony that she was a woman eater and proud to declare herself so at the end of the 19th century, and I am a guy cook at the end of the 20th century and reasonably proud to declare himself so. And then I thought that with an imaginary conversation over those 100 years, something about the difference between her food civilization and our own might be apparent. One of the things that concerned me through that exactly was whether or not was the whole question of I suppose if we were in a university we'd say the gendering of food, but certainly excuse me, the sexuality of food. What it's like, how those sex roles have switched, and what we're to make of the kind of switching that's gone on. And one of the things that came to mind to me was my own occasional unease at taking on a role that in our society has been in the past typically one that women take on. I'm well aware that there is no cheaper or more ostentatious way for a man to lay claim to being a good contributor to the domestic economy than to do the cooking. Because the cooking is the thing that is showy, it is the thing that is finally simple, and it is the thing for which you get extra credit. It's an ostentatious contribution compared to the work that women do every day to keep the whole balance of family life in their heads. In one of my previous books, Through the Children's Gate, I described how my own wife, whose name is Martha, once was able to locate a missing remote for the television from 1,000 miles away, from Edmonton, Alberta, just by hearing. I said, we can't find the remote, we can't find the remote. And she said, when did you last see it? And I said, well, we were watching a movie on Saturday night. And she said, well, what movie were you watching? And I said, we were watching, I don't know, I said, it's like one of those late Star Wars things. She said, oh, she said, then, and where was Olivia, my daughter? Where was she sitting? And I said, oh, she was sitting on the back of the bed, on the right side. And she said, oh, and where were you sitting? I said, oh, like further to the left. She said, oh, then it's right down between the two things on the floor behind the bed. And when I went back and I looked for it and I found it, and it was exactly where it was. I said, how did you know that? She said, oh, because if you're seeing a relatively scary movie like that, then Olivia will scoot over to be a little bit nearer to you. And she would have been clutching the remote because she wouldn't want her brother to have the authority of having the remote. And she would drop it back there. And then you would ask her to look for it there. And her arm is too short to get to the floor. But she would sooner die than admit that, so she would tell you that it wasn't there. So that's where it is. Sure enough, you went and found it, it was there. Women do these things all the time. They keep the entire complicated formula of family life in their heads. We still ask it of them, demand it of them. Men who make a contribution make a much more shallow contribution. I am one of those men who does that. But men are also, I think, tend to be self-conscious about the contribution that they make. And this came home to me when I was reading Keith Richards' autobiography, and I decided to write to Elizabeth Pannell about Keith Richards. Dear Liz, I wrote to her in one of these letters, all these recipes, all this time, I was feeling a bit, unmanned, reduced by the practice of writing down recipes for you, no matter how delicious they might seem or how much one could defend the practice. And so I bought Keith Richards' autobiography, wittily entitled Life to Read. I am a keen Stones fan who begins each day with a piece of their great live album, Get Your Yayas Out. But, it's difficult to explain British R&B to you, Elizabeth, modern woman though you may be, but still a woman of the 19th century. In any case, I keep always an electric guitar tuned to an open G, Keith's favorite key, and strum through it, searching for those voicings, the dumb revelation that most of what seems mysterious and beautiful, from Stone's riffs to béarnaise sauce, is just a matter of breaking down the elements and learning the technique. The tuning, in a way, matters even more than the technique in music and rock and roll, and I wonder if that isn't true of cooking as well. The tuning is just the base of what you do. The eggs you buy, the fishmonger, the thing itself. And with every good cook I've ever known, the sound of the food is really like that. A good tuning and a resonant drone, a fine fish and one favorite spice. In any case, I thought to myself, Keith Richards, there's the man. You should be more like him. Utterly forgiven no matter what he says or does. Declare yourself irresponsible when you begin to act, and all will be forgiven when you are. In this case, his book, crafted as a celebration of living on the edge, is in fact on every page a testimonial to the privileges of money and fame. Each time Keith is about to be arrested for drug possession, he is saved by a lawyer or a wealthy fan or the father of a groupie who intervenes on his behalf. Well, okay, he's still a wonderful guitarist. The funniest and most telling remark in the book concerns his bandmate, Ronnie Wood. After detailing his many long periods of crack addiction and his many efforts in rehab to get free from them, Keith concludes, "To be honest, it didn't make much difference. He was about the same both ways." Thus the epitaph on all artistic addictions. But after all the heroin and the cocaine and the general sense of a man nodding off in space, what really gets the great Keith alight? What does he really care about the most? Yes, he devotes a few glancing evocative paragraphs to guitar playing, to the technique of the blues, a few words to warn against freebasing. But what is the one thing that he offers in carefully itemized detail? The one thing that he offers with real zing and passion? His recipes. His favorite food. His own ways of making shepherd's pie and bangers and mash, which he reproduces right there in the book alongside his tales of scoring heroin on the Riviera. How you should get your bangers made fresh. And then, interesting point this, that you should always put the sausages cold into the frying pan and then slowly turn up the heat. Rather an English approach, but still, okay. And there's something nice about the way he implies that his mashed potatoes, he implies his mashed potatoes, but doesn't feel it necessary to explain his mashed potatoes. His shepherd's pie, ground meat, and more of those mashed potatoes sounds very good. And as a true food lover will, he insists that the key moment is the moment when you plunge the knife into the shepherd's pie. And then there is a connection here, trust me. The point that Keith makes about his distinctive open G tuning is that it's a drone tuning, a folk tuning. That one steady note, the G, buzzing in the background, even as the rest of the chords mark the changes. And he makes the musically alert point that Vivaldi and Mozart write this way too, in reverse, with a steady, unchanging note up in the treble. Now, would you agree with me that the folk tuning of food, the open G tuning of the kitchen, is rice pudding? Everywhere you go in the food world, there is a rice pudding playing somewhere in the background, droning a little sweet and nubbly number behind everything more ambitious that goes on. If you go out for Indian food, you can rely on a rice pudding. If you go for Italian food or Greek, there is, somewhere on the menu, a pudding made with rice. In every culture, in every country, some mix of rice and milk or coconut milk and vanilla or cardamom and sugar or honey is the drone sound of the table. And this pudding, is almost always part of rites of passage, of weddings and christenings and funerals, gifts to the gods and rites of the elders. There seems to be something close to a natural magnetism between rice and ritual, most familiar to us in the habit of throwing rice at weddings. And you remember Woody Allen's great line about the wedding he went to where the bride was pregnant and they threw puffed rice? And what's more, just as Keith says about open G tuning, that it lets you add stray extra notes to the core, so that in every G there's a touch of A, and every B dominant seventh, a little hint of E minor, is true of pudding making too. A certain sloppy elegance is necessary in both rock guitar and rice desserts. And then I go on to give you my 3 favorite recipes for rice pudding: a baked rice pudding, a French rice pudding, and an Indian rice pudding. So let nobody tell you that this book is not full of... Salman Rushdie won't give you recipes. He'll be here later this week. He'll talk, very entertaining guy, great writer. He will not give you recipes. This book is filled with them. But then I ask, why does rice pudding, in any of its forms, have this ritual resonance? The answer, I think, lies simply in the slowness of its achievement. Eggs are little miracles. 1 minute slime, the next a meal. Meats are primal. But as a rice pudding develops in slow and gradual stages, not even stages, phases, a slow and gradual field passing from inedible hard grains and unpalatable raw eggs and milk to some combined, involved, semi-soupy, semi-cereal, sweet and starchy but both at once delight. Rice pudding is like life. It's hard at first, it gradually thickens, and ends well enough to make you wish you could have it again. No wonder we use it to mark the passages of life. In addition to all the letters to Elizabeth Pannell, including the letter about Keith, there's also a great deal in the book about thinking about food, the way we talk about food, the way we write about food. What do we write about when we write about food? What do we imagine when we imagine food? And one of the chapters actually takes on the question of writing about food in books. Let me read you, if you'll let me, a little bit of that chapter. Recently, there was an exchange in the pages of the Times Literary Supplement about the presence and the propriety of recipes in novels, and I intend to settle the questions that have arisen there in the American way, right now and for good. There are 4 kinds of food in books, only 4. Food that is served by an author to characters who are not expected to taste it. Food that is served by an author to characters in order to show who they are. Food that an author cooks for characters in order to eat it with them. And last and most recently, food that an author cooks for characters but actually serves to the readers. Most books that have food in them, including the classic 19th century novels, have the first kind of food. Food that is served by an author to characters who are not expected to taste it. In one trollop novel after another, 3 meals a day, the parsons and the politicians eat chops or steaks or mutton, but the dishes are all essentially interchangeable, mere stops on the ribbon of narrative, signs of life and social transactions, rather than specific pleasures. Mr. Peregrine greatly enjoyed his chop, Trollope will tell us, or for Dr. Patterson, even the usual satisfaction he took in his beefsteak and porter was somewhat diminished by the thought that. Such food provides space for a moment of reflection. The dishes are the foam peanuts in the packaging of classic narrative. There are moments in Trollope when what a character drinks matters, claret, good or bad, porter or port, but his food is, in every sense, at the service of his story. Then there are writers who dish up very particular food to their characters to show us who the characters are. Proust is the second kind of writer, and Henry James is too. Now, Proust seems so full of food, crushed strawberries and madeleines, tisane and champagne, that entire recipe books have been extracted from his texts. But he's not actually a greedy writer. That his people are eating lobster or veal matters to who they are and how they feel about who they are, but we are never meant to leave the page hungry. Proust will say that someone is eating a meal of gigot with sauce béarnaise, but he seldom says that the character had a delicious meal of gigot with sauce béarnaise, though he will extend his adjectives to the weather or the view. He uses food as a sign of something else. The third kind of writer is so greedy that he goes on at length about the things his characters are eating or are about to eat, serving it in front of us, and then snatching it from our mouths. Ian Fleming, for instance, the creator of James Bond, is obsessed with food. Gluttony, far more than lust, is the electric current of his hero's adventures. Newcomers to James Bond, imagining him to be the roughneck he has once again become in movies, will be startled to see how much time he spends in Casino Royale and the other early Bond novels giving advice to his girls and his spy superiors on what to eat, with the author hovering over his shoulder as he examines the menu. The problem with caviar, Bond announces, is getting enough toast. Not true. English cooking is the best in the world when it's good. Was certainly not true in the 1950s. And rosé champagne goes perfectly with crabs. Very true. His creator, one feels, as the excitement builds, is not just itemizing the food, waiter-like, but actually sitting at the table and sharing it with them. Now, the fourth kind of writer belongs only and exclusively to our own time. And he presents on the page not just the result, but the whole process. Not just what people eat, but how they make it. Exactly how much garlic is chopped and how, and when it is placed in the pan. Sometimes entire recipes are included in the text. So I go on to make some of the recipes from outstanding contemporary novels. One of the ones I made is from, I made a recipe from Günter Grass's The Flounder, and then I made a recipe from Robert B. Parker's School Days, one of those wonderful Spencer mysteries. And in that recipe, Spencer, the great detective, actually shells shell beans, borlotti beans as they're called in England, shell beans as we call them here. And I was impressed by that. I wrote, "The beans alone established Spencer's credibility as a cook. He tells us, I shelled the beans from their long red and cream pods and dropped them in boiling water and turned down the heat and let them simmer. A devotion to shell beans, I have noticed, divides amateur cooks from non-cooks more absolutely than any other food, and they are, into the bargain, a perfect model of the writer's task. Like sentences, shell beans are a great deal more trouble to produce than anyone who isn't producing them knows. You have to shell the beans, slipping open the pods with your thumbnail, and then tugging the beautiful little prismatic buttons from their moorings. A process that, like writing, always takes much longer than you think it will. And then even the best shell beans, cleaned and simmered, are like sentences in that nobody actually appreciates them as much as they ought to be appreciated. Shell beans are several steps more delicious, lighter and finer than dried beans, let alone canned beans. But the sad truth is that nobody really cares beans about beans, and not many eaters can tell the fresh kind from the dried or even the canned. And I go on to conclude about the whole business of reading about food in novels, that it doesn't really matter how much cooking a novel contains, because in the end it goes back to being a book, as all books will. Even cookbooks, this is the point I was trying to make in the recipe chapter, are finally more book than they are cook. And more we know it. For every novel that contains a recipe, there is now a recipe book meant to be read as a novel. When we read in the great French chef Alain Ducasse's recent culinary encyclopedia a recipe for Colonna bacon-barded thrush breasts with giblet canapes on a porcini mushroom marmalade, we know that we are not seriously expected to cook this. Rather, we are to admire it over and over for the literary skill, the metaphysical poetry required to bring these improbable things together. You and I are not about to cook thrush breasts with a porcini mushroom marmalade. Alain Ducasse is not about to cook them either, any more than we are about to throw ourselves under the train with Anna Karenina or sleep with Madame Bovary. The secret consolation may be that it works the other way around as well. The space between imaginary food and books and real food is exactly the space where reading happens. The people we encounter in novels are ultimately mere recipes too. So many eyes, so many bright teeth, so many repeated tics and characterizing mannerisms, and we accept that we cannot perfectly reproduce them either. Our mental picture of the characters in contemporary novels, like our mental picture of Lady Glencora Palliser and Trollope, is as hard won as the bouillabaisse we find in Ian McEwan. Ian McEwan has a wonderful recipe for bouillabaisse in his novel Saturday. As vague in critical aspects and is likely to vary from maker to maker, from reader to reader. We read about the beach town of Cabourg and Proust and are unprepared for what we find when we actually get there. The act of reading, it seems, is always a matter of a task begun as much as of a message understood. Something that starts on a flat surface, a counter or a page, and then gets stirred and chopped and blended until what we make in the end is a dish or a story, all our own. Having gone through the act of arriving, the act of choosing, a long chapter about wine. Is there such a thing as a wine expert, a wine connoisseur, as we say in our family? Or is it all a form of fakery? And I try and tease out that question. I end with the one place where food, where every dinner ends, and that's with dessert, and with the rights and wrongs, the ethics of sugar eating and its history. And in the course of learning about desserts and about the endings of meals, I got to go to Barcelona, where the new frontiers in desserts are being started. Let me read you a little bit about my trip to Barcelona to learn about how to end a dinner. On the plane over to Barcelona, I felt like Alec Guinness or Michael Caine in a Cold War spy movie of the somber Le Carré or Len Dayton kind, a black and white film with a jazz score and a grimly ambiguous ending. I was crossing the salt caramel curtain and no turning back. When I got to Barcelona, there was, just as there ought to be in such a movie, a cool, efficient beauty in a black frock and a sports car waiting for me. This was Lisa Auberge, an American writer who lives in Spain and who was to be my companion in Barcelona. She had spent the past season observing the innards of the great restaurant El Bulli while writing a book about the Oompa Loompas of the operation. We pulled up in the darkness to a modern glass storefront, which I had been told was the central dessert research space in Barcelona. Inside, Jordi Boutron, the chief scientist cook of the research center, greeted us solemnly and led us into his classroom. On the blackboard behind his head was a series of abstruse-looking diagrams. With a close-shaved beard and mustache, he had more the look of a severe French sociologist than of a happy Spanish cook. I explained that I was on a quest to find out what desserts really were and where they were going. He held up a hand and began to speak in rapid, accented French. In retrospect, they're disgusting. Disgusting, the things we used to do. Too much fat and too much sugar, and a series of cliches taught while being rationalized, he said. The key thing now for a cook is to develop a library of flavors that you can recall. If I say to you apple and cinnamon, you would click in immediately. Yes, apple. Yes, cinnamon. The library of your mind contains it. But if I said to you apple, asafoetida, nothing. You have nothing stored there. He's added slyly, now this is a benefit to the chef, frankly, because if I do apple and cinnamon and you don't like it, you think there is something wrong with me. But if I do apple and asafoetida and you don't like it, there's something wrong with you. He laughed briefly and professionally. The development of a pastry chef is not the development of techniques. It is the slow, careful development of a catalog of savors and flavors, which you can develop the way you develop muscles. There is a logic, there must be a logic in every dessert worth eating. Consider the logic of white peach and rich cheese. We must be conditioned, though, not by sight, but only by flavor, the tongue, the nose, and the feel in the mouth. He went on placidly. It is to avoid these errors that we do almost all of our teaching and learning blindfolded. Blindfolded? I said, wondering if I had misunderstood him. Yes, blindfolded, he repeated. He went to a drawer and took out a handful, perhaps 30 silken eye masks, which he threw on the desk. It is important to be able to work with the sensations of the nose and mouth alone, so we spend hours in the dark with our students tasting. Of course, appearance matters, but it is the last part of the equation. Taste, taste, taste. That is what matters. So I keep the students blindfolded for much of the work, which is devoted to the marriages of taste. The next day, I went off and I got to meet the great dessert chef, Albert Adria, one of the two founding brothers of El Bulli. And I asked him what he was working on just then. Struggling to find words, he began to talk about his most recent work in desserts. 2 desserts for the 2010 Cook at Raw conference in Lapland, which would emphasize low-energy techniques in uncooked food. Elemental, he said, that is all I want now. The really new idea I have for Lapland is, you see, I was thinking if you were thirsty there, you would eat the snow or the ice. And if you're hungry, you're going to kill the reindeer. So, blood. The most basic thing is to drink the reindeer's blood and eat the snow. So I made sweet snow and sweet blood. The key for the blood is your belief that it really is blood. It looks like real blood, only at a temperature of 40 degrees. It's actually a beet and orange reduction. But the texture, I promise, is exactly the same as blood. So we're not going to tell anyone that it's not real blood. It's meant to be provocative, though it's very delicious. Is there anything you've tried that didn't work out? I asked him. Something that you've tried and failed at. I should add that I've always found in my work as a reporter that that's the ideal question to ask anybody after you've won their confidence, is to ask them, what have they wanted to do that they haven't been able to do yet? Everybody has a holy grail. Everybody has a quixotic adventure, and certainly Alberto Adria was one of them. There are many, he said to me. One of the first things that Ferran asked me to do was create hot ice cream. Hot ice cream, I said. He nodded gloomily. Yes, you would look at it, ice cream, and then you would taste it, and it would be hot. Every year I have thought that I had it, but I never have had it. What we discovered was to use an ice cream machine, but invert it, so that it was pumping in hot air, and to use gelatin to get the form. That was as close as we've gotten. It's still this idea we have. He shook his head. A sort of dream. I have a lot of them. The next day I went to visit Ferran Adria, the older brother, who's really an older brother. Older brothers are always bullies and self-confident. And as I said about Ferran, if his younger brother is very much the kind of artist like a Georges Braque, it's kind of stolid and inward, Ferran is very much a Picasso, a grand maître who knows it. Like every first-rate artist I've ever met, he has the kind of immense egomania that is completely impersonal. His greatness is so uncontroversial to him that it is an act of generosity on his part to try to limit it in words and dates. There is a certain kind of artistic egotism that is enveloping rather than narrowing, saying less, all I care about is my work, than if you only cared about my work as much as I do, you would be as routinely elated as I am. I asked him if we were breaking down the line between sweet and savory in his work. And he looked at me with delighted triumph. It can't be that an American is asking me that, he said. A hamburger with ketchup and Coca-Cola. That's the most intense symbiosis of sweet and savory imaginable, and it's your cultural theme. As I was getting ready to leave the restaurant, Ferran grabbed the pages of diagrams that he had made for me, tracing the history of El Bulli, and handed them to me for further study. He continued brooding on the subject of dessert, explaining that for him the big question was not that of sweet and savory, but that of sequence. What matters is how we end the meal. With a surprise, a flourish, reassurance, that's the real question about desserts. How do we close out dinner? How do we finish the meal? He had a pensive look, and I couldn't help asking him about Albert's unmade dream. His face came alive again. "Ah, you mean hot ice cream? Yes, Yes, that is the question. But it's hard. Ice cream, I have figured out now. Ice cream is ice cream because it's cold. But you know, gelatin is the same way. Gelatin used to be both gelatin and cold. There must be some way. We will solve it. We will. And then he signed the diagrams in caps, Ferran Adria. But I think that Ferran was exactly right, that the real question about dessert is not about crossing the line between sweet and savory. It's exactly symbolically about endings, how we end our meal, and in a larger sense, how we end our lives, which turns us back to the material at the very beginning of the book and to Jacques Decour's question. And the joyful discovery we made, and that I've been able to include in the very end of the book, is that the restaurant, the Auberge that Jacques Decour discovered and that he left the menu from for his mistress, his lover, when he died, on the day he died, still exists. The Auberge de Quatre Pavés de Roi is still out there, about an hour outside of Paris, still in business, still continually in service since that day. So this book and my adventure in trying to answer Jacques Decour's question about why questions of food have taken on great importance ended where it began, at the Auberge de Quatre Pavés de Roi, in a simple summer lunch with my family. And I wrote, faith in history, which he had once, not to mention in the utopian state, has vanished in various ways, noisy and silent. But the relation between the end of faith in heaven and the assertion of faith in something else has not. The continuity of life, the continuity of the table, is one in the face of time and tragedy, and the rituals of an inn in the country is one of the places that we located it in. We find it here. I believe in the Inn of the Four Seasons, that Decour went there with a girl he loved, that he left her the menu when he knew the Nazis were going to kill him, that it has moved and not moved, the restaurant, been rebuilt and yet is still the same, so that we can eat there now. They could walk in now and be happy again in the garden. It would all be different, but they would still be at home. We walked under the same sign that he did and contemplated the connections. He had thought about that in his last moments. That the table came last to mind is another way in which the table always comes first. Did I tell you that I found a photograph of him? Well, here he is. He looks terrifically elegant, doesn't he? Oddly humorous, and he seems to be making a joke with his fork above those two bowls. What's he doing exactly? I think he may have a little bit of pasta in one bowl and the sauce in the other. A French manner of eating pasta that I've often noticed, more controlled and precise than the Italian way. He's certainly engaged in a small, sweet joke about eating, whatever the joke may be. I look at the picture often and wonder, in his three-piece suit and neat parted hair, who could imagine that he would choose the fate he chose and try to keep the pleasures of the table present in his mind, even as he did. In any case, there he is, and here we are, and whatever connection there may be, straight or crooked, occult or true, it passed across and around a table. For people who live in this life alone, trying to decide how best to live, questions of food will always be of great importance. That's the book in a nutshell, in several stops. And I would love, if I may, to take your questions on this book, other books, the magazine, puppies, anything that's on your mind.
Hi.
Hi.
Can't tell you how much I enjoyed listening to you read, and I look forward to reading the whole book. I have a couple of other books of yours. I have three questions. I'll try to keep it brief.
Sure.
What do you think of Martha Stewart, who has been said that she goes to bed reading cookbooks? That's all she reads. What do you think? Do you have her cookbooks in your collection?
Right.
And what do you think of her?
Sure. Why don't you give me all three questions and I'll answer them? Yes.
You're awesome. Okay. Second is, I've read a lot of mysteries that are now incorporating recipes in their mysteries, and you brought out Robert Parker. And even though I've read Parker, I don't remember the bean story.
Right.
But do you like the cat recipe? Do you like that genre? That's the second. And the third is, what is your sublime eating experience in New York City?
Wonderful. All right. Let me answer those three questions in order. Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart's a very good citizen of the food empire. When we were doing a benefit dinner, Alice Waters, the great chef from Berkeley, came in to do a dinner for the Edible Schoolyard, the foundation that she has to try and treat lunch as a subject for kids to learn. Martha Stewart was terrific. She came, she bought seats, she really believes in all that side of things. I'm the guy in this book who reads himself to sleep with recipes and recipe books every night, so I certainly understand that urge. And I've always enjoyed her magazine. So I think that on the whole, we're all absurd in one way or another, and that includes her and me and all the rest of us. But given all of that, I think that she does a terrific job of, she's on the right side. She's on the side of the angels. Second thing about recipes and mystery stories, as I try and explain in the book, I think that the reason that there's so many more recipes, not just in mystery stories, but in novels and writing generally, is because we're always searching for a background against which we can think. If you think about 19th century novels, what are people always doing? They're walking, they take walks. Trollope and George Eliot and Dickens, when people are faced with a moral crisis, they go for a long walk and they think as they walk. Well, we don't really take long walks anymore as modern Americans. What do we do? Well, you could drive in a car, and for instance, in Ann Tyler's novels, people are always taking long car drives and they're having their revelations then. But if you're not a suburban person, what do? You cook. You do your thinking while you're cooking. And I think the reason why you see so much more food in genre novels and mystery novels, but also in serious novels, is exactly because it's the natural place where we do our thinking. It's when you sit down, you start to chop onions, you think about your failed marriage, you think about George W. Bush, you think about Occupy Wall Street. That's when we do our most natural thinking. And that's why I think we have so many more cooking scenes in our literature, high and low. And my sublime eating experience in New York. I've had so many, I hesitate to single out one. Let me single out one very low and one very high. When I first came to New York 30 years ago, when I used to live in this store downstairs, not in the classy room, but in the room downstairs, we, like all young couples, were on a very limited budget, and I would get my lunch every day from the Papaya King on 86th Street, 3rd Avenue and 86th Street, before I would get on the subway and come down to NYU, and then be here. And I still think that that was one of the great experiences, but because the hot dogs of Papaya King, remember they're advertised as tastier than filet mignon, if not that, are actually extremely good. So my favorite lunch was always a Papaya King Frankfurter and a Papaya King papaya. And the great thing is they're still in business, still cheap, and I can take my kids in there for lunch, and I have the wonderful, the incomparable pleasure of being morally superior, because I can point to it and say, you know, that's all I ate for 2 years was those hot dogs. Now think about everything you get every day, and that's all I ate. And there's no pleasure as great as being morally superior to your children, because they are morally superior to you. So if I had to single out one thing that's like New York for me, it would be, that would be it. And beyond that, I think that the kind of the local delicacy I value most and cherish most is shad. I love good New York shad and shad roe.
Any questions from this side?
Someone else?
Someone on that side?
About anything, just.
What do you think of the Russian tea room? Did you eat there?
I used to eat there back in the day when it was.
Wasn't that sublime?
That was always wonderful. That was always wonderful. It was festive too. We love festive restaurants. We love restaurants that have Christmas ornaments up all year round. I think it's a good plan. Somebody else, and about anything. Yes, gentleman here.
What's the one thing that you like to do that you haven't done?
In food or in life?
Everybody's got a holy grail, so what's yours?
In food, do you mean, or just in general? Because we could take this many different directions.
Maybe in your writing. Perhaps.
In my writing, okay. Excuse me. In food, I can tell you truly, I would love sometime. I've lived in France, been lucky enough, really lucky to live in France. I've never lived in Italy for any length of time, and one of my dreams would be to go and live in Italy for a year or two, to cook, but just to live. So that would be one thing. We got to live in a little apartment. We rented a little apartment in Venice once, and that was a terrific experience, the market and the thing. That would be one thing. As a writer, I've written some long, I hate that word, long form, some full-length narratives in the form of what are called children's novels, but are really kind of adventure and fantasy novels. And as I said once, not for children of all ages, but for adults of any condition, because I'm told you have to be somewhat adult to read them. And I'm pleased with them, but I've never been able to do a successful narrative for grown-ups. And that's one of the things I'd like to do, to write longer narrative. And the kind of work I do involves a certain kind. It's like when you're an essay writer, as I am essentially, you're writing kind of 400 meters and 800 meters all the time. And you develop a certain, I hope, a certain expertise after a quarter century at running those races. But there are miles and 1,500 meters and marathons, and at some point you would like to try those, even if you're the person who comes out limping at the end and has to be wrapped up in the foil by your publisher and hauled off. But that I think would be the thing I'd like to try longer narrative as I go forward. I don't know that I would be any good at it, but I would like to try it. Lady here.
I'm about a third of the way through, but one of the things that struck me early on, I think even in the introduction, just the way that people eat now and eat today. And for me, I'm in my 20s, and largely all my time is spent eating alone. And one of the things that people do a lot more now, because so many people eat alone, is engage in social media while they're eating. And so I'm maybe tweeting about what I'm eating, maybe tweeting a picture, maybe Facebooking to my friends and family, and then there's sort of that exchange. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about social media and the internet and sort of how we eat and eating alone more.
Well, three things. One is that the greatest effect that, excuse me, I'm aware of is, first of all, is that the recipe book has been totally disaggregated. And I write about that in the book. That's a really big thing, because the disaggregation of traditional vehicles, I mean, the classic one is the long-playing album, right? The music industry totally knocked cold because you can take a track from here, track from there. And the great work of something like the Beatles, or for that matter, Frank Sinatra, where you have whole things that stick together now, no longer be possible in that way. So it's a good thing that I can go online if I want to find, say, how do you do pasta with crab and peas? I could do pasta, crab, and peas and then get 30 recipes, right? On the other hand, I no longer, the great pleasure of having it as part of a more coherent, larger view isn't available in the same way. So that's one loss. I've never had the experience of, though I should have done, of dining with social media. When you've got kids at home, they have the social media in their hands as you're dining with them, and you spend your time saying, we are not dining with social media tonight. Please turn off the iPhone and please turn, no screens at the table. So that's another side of it. I very much enjoy eating alone, though. That is something that I've always found to be a great guilty pleasure. You always are told that when you're on the road, as I have to be a lot of the time, that if there's a painting of a sad person, it's a writer or someone else dining alone in a sad little 11 o'clock restaurant. I love that experience. I have never... Yes, exactly. I've never understood why Hopper's Nighthawks is supposed to be such a sad picture. They look like they're having a very good time. They're sitting there in that lovely diner. It's late at night. They're cozy inside. They're having some chili or a cup of coffee. And, policeman and prostitute and kind of all the local folks. I've never understood why that's sad. I've always thought that I'd like to be in that room. So I feel that way strongly. So I certainly think the internet has changed cooking in terms of the availability of recipes, disaggregation of recipe books. As I said, I haven't had the actual experience of tweeting while I'm eating, but I will try and start doing it as time goes by. Sounds like fun. I knew once, let me go to someone else and then come back to you if I may. I knew, actually, I will not name a name here, but a celebrity cook who I got to eat dinner with once had a designated tweeter whose job was to tweet for him as he ate, describing where he was and what he was eating. So he had an assistant, like a sous chef, but it was a sous tweeter. I thought that was extremely cool. Yes?
My friend who told me about you.
That's a very ominous way to start.
He said that he repeats your story about the Parisian health club and the stewardess-like attendants to this very day. Is that a story you could tell?
Sure. It's collected in my book Paris to the Moon, which I think somebody has up here. When I was living in Paris, I'm one of those obnoxious New Yorkers, who has no athletic ability of any kind, but who goes to a gym every day. Actually, I don't do it as a ritual of courtship, but one of the things I talk about in this book is how the restaurant, in its first appearance in Paris in around the 1780s, 90s, 1800s, one of the things it did was it gave a social space where unattached women and unattached men could be together in a completely legitimate way, because they were both going for their health. They were going to eat healthy food. And health is the universal euphemism for sex, right? You can always, if you go to a health club, you can dress any way you want. You can basically be nude in a health club and it's completely acceptable. Well, I wanted to join a gym in Paris. And we finally found one called, it was called La Compagnie Bleue. In the book, I call it Le Régiment Rouge. We joined, and we said to the people that we would like to join for a high-intensity membership. And they said, oh, that would be great, because we have a high-intensity membership. You can come as often as once a week. And we said to the lady, well, there are people in New York who go to their gyms every day before they go to work. And she said, memorably in French, she said, that must be a very wearing regimen. Anyway, it turned out that we had found a health club in which it was possible certainly to be healthy. They passed out chocolate truffles when you came for an orientation, but which it was essentially impossible to get anything recognizable as exercise, because it was clear that anybody who wanted to exercise in that desperate way was morally troubled and putting their life at risk by doing it. So that's what the story was about our futile attempt to exercise at a Parisian health club. It's called Rules of the Sport, and it's in Paris the Moon. Someone else here, lady here.
Do you have a worst dining experience?
Worst dining experience. Well, you know, I generally don't like, probably shouldn't say this, I generally don't like most kind of fancy places. I mean, the best places I've ever eaten have been fancy, expensive places, there's no doubt about it. But as a rule, I find that we've sort of entered a realm where, talk about the disaggregation of things, where we've sort of disaggregated great food from expensive food. So one of the things I talk about in the book is how much I dislike what passes for desserts at most fancy restaurants now, because you never actually get a dessert. Instead, you get something that I call the Portman Plaza plate, because it looks like a inner city development from the 1970s, you know, with a strong vertical element like a skyscraper sliced off in the top, and then a reflecting pool of gelatin around it. And it feels like 4 or 5 things are going on, none of them particularly tasty and none of them attractive to each other. So my worst meals in that sense have been there, except, and I hear your accent, I'm not sure where you're from, as a kid in London in the 1970s. Now you get absolutely wonderful food almost everywhere in London. But in those days, you would get sort of these slow steam burgers that were particularly, and sandwiches turning up at the edges. And I remember those as food from my London wandering days at that time. That isn't true any longer, but it was true. It was true then. I'm trying to think if there's any other particularly horrific experience I've had.
Or any particular kind of horrific food or ingredient or something that you...
Something I really don't like, something I really don't care for.
Or is there anything that you wouldn't eat?
Is there anything I wouldn't eat? Well, you know, I'm not an adventurous eater. That whole kind of line of kind of macho eating, you know, the rattlesnake testicle ragu that I made when I climbed to the top of Pikes Peak in the company of 3 starlets and, you know, and my adopted son. That whole kind of thing is not really for me. I'm not that kind of eater. But there's nothing I don't think that I would...
How about slimy okra?
Slimy okra, like all the kind of difficult foods, like Brussels sprouts, I quite enjoy. Jello, I like Jello. Prairie oysters, not so much.
Marmite.
I have a dear friend, the wonderful movie critic Anthony Lane, who lives on a diet of Marmite and strong tea. So I can never properly criticize that. So I can't think of anything of that kind. You know, the truth is that I'm not, and this sounds so banal, but it's true, that I'm not the world's biggest sushi fan. Who was the comedian who said, you know, that it was, you know, they said, yes, what we eat here on this island is raw fish and hot wine. As a way of getting rid of everybody, right? And then they were stuck with it once they'd said it. So that's a great thing, a thing that I know people appreciate, has a real complicated aesthetic that doesn't speak to my condition particularly. Someone else. This lady over here? Someone else? I thought I saw another hand. Can be gentleman here.
How do you distinguish quality recipes from ones that aren't?
You can't. One of the themes of this book is that you can't really. I mean, you can, of course. You read things. If you're a compulsive recipe reader, you sort of visualize it in your mind, and then you go on. One of my favorite recipe stories of my own is that when we were living abroad, living in France, you develop a longing for spicy food. One of the things we're not fully conscious of living in New York is how much incidental sugar there is in our meals and how much incidental spice there is in our meals as well. The incidental sugar will stun you. When you come back to America after a long time away, everything you eat is sweet. You're not prepared for how much, you know, things that you don't think of as sweet, like ketchup, for instance. Ketchup is a form of syrup. Everything has sugar, corn. Anything you eat is much sweeter than what you eat typically in Europe. So that's the incidental sugar. And also we have a much spicier palate, kind of baseline palate and elsewhere. Well, when we were living abroad, I got totally nostalgic for spicy food. And I got a recipe for Thai green curry, which for some reason we didn't eat a great deal. I think it was just the accidents of a New York neighborhood. We had a Burmese takeout near us, but not a Thai takeout. We lived down in Soho. And so I wanted to make a green curry, so I followed the recipe. And it was way too soupy, I thought. It was like very kind of soupy. So I thought, oh, you must have to thicken this sauce more. So I spent months and months trying to get the sauce the appropriate level of thickness, only to come back to New York and order a green curry and find that it was completely soupy. That's the way it's supposed to be, actually. And I realized I liked my version for the kind of French sauce with it better than I liked the way it actually should be. But that's the kind of the fun and the poetry of recipes is you always end up someplace you don't expect to be, and sometimes the place you end up is better than the place you thought you were going to get to. Lady here, I knew you had a question. I could see in your eyes.
What are some of your most beloved cookbooks that you find yourself coming back to?
Oh, what a good question. Most beloved cookbooks. Off the top of my head, let me think of three. One is a classic, is Patricia Wells' Bistro Cooking. That's one I think everybody who likes to cook loves that book, and I cook a lot of things from it. Great roast chicken from Lemie Louis, great gratin of potatoes from, what was that place? It's not open anymore. Anyway, wonderful things throughout that book. In London, the River Cafe in London is one of my favorite places, and their cookbooks are models of simplicity and clarity and joy. So all of that line of cookbooks, I think there are 5 of them now, I have and I cook from all the time for pastas and even for desserts. The lemon tart in that cookbook is something that I dearly love. If I have 2 sort of things that I make when there's company coming, one would be the pork with balsamic vinegar in the First River Cafe cookbook, and the other would be, there's a wonderful loin of tuna with, we shouldn't be eating tuna, I know, but put that aside for one moment. Loin of tuna with cinnamon and tomato and mint sauce. It's just fantastic. So that's another thing I love to do. So those 2, River Cafe and Pat Wells' Bistro Cooking. And a third would be, well, this is an old-fashioned one, but one that I get great pleasure from, is Richard Olney's book, The French Menu Cookbook. I don't know if anyone remembers Richard Olney. He was one of the great makers of French cooking in America. And it's not entirely to our taste now because it's extremely fussy. You know, there was a moment in the 60s when fuss budget cooking was highly prized, right? You know, you don't tolerate this, you can't have that. We're much more relaxed now in that way. But the juxtapositions of dishes and the whole attitude of that is one that I dearly love. That's a cookbook. The Richard Olney French Menu Cookbook is almost like a work of literature. And that would be the third one on my shelf, and that I get enormous pleasure from. So those 3, I think: Pat Wells, Richard Olney, and Ruthie Rogers and Rose Gray's River Cafe cookbooks. I'll come back to you in just one second. Let me just see if there's anyone else, because I think we should probably be winding up now. The Strand is telling me we should probably be winding up now. All right, come, give me one last question.
My favorite restaurant in Paris with Arrondissement was Le Cookbooks.
Ah, it's a lovely place.
Did you ever eat there? Oh.
Yes, I can repeat the question. This lady is saying nicely that her favorite restaurant in the 5th arrondissement of Paris, which is a wonderful arrondissement. It's around the Sorbonne. is Le Cookbooks. Not only did I eat there, but I used to take, there's a wonderful guy named Jim Cuneo, who's now the head of the Getty in Los Angeles, and at that time was the head of the Fogg Museum at Harvard, and he would bring, kind of a boatload of Americans over every spring, and I would address them in exchange for a meal at Le Cookbooks. And that's a lovely place to climb up the escarpment there.
Yes. Did you go down to did you have the after dinner drink in the lower levels of the cave?
I had 2 small children at that time, and after dinner drinks were rarely on the menu. I had to get there, but that's a lovely place. Along with one of the great joys of Paris life, as we know, is continuity. That is, that things go on. It's one of the great joys of Paris life. It's also one of the great traps of Paris life for Parisians, and it's one of the reasons why my friends and the fooding, the movement I describe in this book, which is attempting to shake up and revolutionize French cooking, feel trapped by the very things that we most cherish. And it's one of the paradoxes and ironies of French-American relations, is that the very thing we love, that the waiters are still there and the place is still there, is the very thing that makes them incredibly frustrated and difficult. Listen, delighted to sign books. Thank you all for coming, and carry on the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.